Welcome to Supervisor Training, Dual Diagnosis. My name is Catherine Mullins. I have been employed with PeerStar for about the past year and a half. I got my MBA from Walden University, my bachelor's in behavioral sciences from the Mount, and I have my associate's degree in depth studies from the Mount as well. I've been working in the field for the past 15 years in all types of capacities, but mainly focused on intellectual disabilities. You're going through this orientation for supervisor because you were chosen to become a certified peer support supervisor for peer support for dual diagnosis for PeerStar. This training is going to go over some specific information that might be helpful to go over before you start working independently in the dual diagnosis program. So we're just going to go over the responsibilities of the supervisor. Some of you may or may not know this. This depends on if you are already a supervisor and already doing supervisions. But your responsibilities as a supervisor is to do supervision with all of your employees, checking notes of your CPSs, helping with productivity, collaborating with teams, collaborating with intake, completing transfers, initial IRPs, and IRP revisions, dual diagnosis transition, which we'll go over today, and then also supporting recovery, not only in ourselves, but our CPSs, and supporting recovery for our peers as well. So we're going to go over dual diagnosis documentation. You should have already gone over supervisor documentation when you had your orientation with one of your regional directors. This is going to be a supplement. This is just going to be dual diagnosis documentation that we'll be doing today. If you need more information, you are encouraged to reach out to your regional director to get that information. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ANSA. ANSA assessments are the assessments that we do at PeerStar, and that is in order to complete an initial recovery plan, whether that's a revision or initial. We are helping individuals make that plan and start their goals. Now, if you haven't had ANSA training, this isn't going to make much sense to you, so you should probably stop and go to your regional director to get that ANSA training and then come back to do this training. The next couple slides are going to show more information on how to complete an ANSA for dual diagnosis specifically. Each slide is going to have an example and an explanation with it, so please ask questions if you're unsure. So in order for this to work, if you have questions, you are going to have a box after this slide where you can enter your questions. It'll go directly to me, Katie, and then I can then email you the answer to your questions, or you can reach out to me in an email or text message, or you can call my phone as well. You should be shadowing an ANSA before you go out and do one on your own, and that would be done with a person that has already had ANSA training for dual diagnosis. So that would be one of our designated supervisors that you'll go out with. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the ANSA together. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of how I ask the questions on each page and why it might look a little different from things that you're doing when you do an ANSA. So whenever I go out to the home, our documentation is really no different until you get down to crisis prevention and management plans. The difference that I see when I do an ANSA is I ask the questions differently. Our population with dual diagnosis needs to have questions asked in a more simple way and maybe in a way that they can comprehend, process that information, and then answer the questions. So the ANSA is not really set up for someone that has a dual diagnosis. And so because of that, I can't just ask the questions like your strengths are blah, blah, blah. I have to kind of get a feel for who that person is and have more of a conversation, because that's where I'm going to be able to pick out the information that I need in order to be successful in answering the questions with the peer. So the first thing I'm going to point out is the consent for services, CPS disclosure, risk disclosure, HIPAA statement and notice, patient choice, and additional information is going to be no different. Those are going to basically be laid out the same. You're going to ask the same or tell them the same information. Now, if they need clarification on these pages, you can go into more clarification on what you mean. But with these, they're going to get them mailed out to them. And that's what I always tell them, and I always choose mail to them, because then a caregiver or someone close to them or even themselves can then go back through the documentation and get that information. What is going to be a little bit different is going to be strengths, caregiver, crisis, all the domains, and then the crisis prevention and aftercare. We're going to see a little bit of difference with these, and especially on how we ask the questions. So the first one we're going to go over is strengths. So this page is set up for talking about things that are a support to them, that is good in their lives, that they don't need to work on. So that would be a strength for them. Now, if you would just ask somebody with a dual diagnosis what their strengths are, you might have a little bit of a harder time getting that out of them. So usually what I ask is, tell me about your family. Tell me about going out into the community and what that looks like. Tell me about, your job history. Did you ever have a job? When you did have a job, what did it look like? Because usually they're going to tell you a little bit of a story, right? So if somebody asked me, tell me about your family, I would go into, I grew up with 2 older sisters, and my mom and dad are still married, and they're still living. I don't live with them anymore. I am married. I have my own family. So you see what I mean? Like, I am kind of painting a picture, and that's really how we're supposed to be asking these questions, so I can get a clear picture. Now I'm going to paint you the picture, and then I'm going to probably start telling you a little bit more if the person allows me that time. I might tell you that we have our rifts, and at times we get into arguments, but we always come back together, and we still enjoy each other's company, and I still support them and they still support me. So for me, a family would be a strength because of everything that I just said. I have family, they are supportive of me, I'm supportive of them, everything along those lines. So that's something that you would want to know. And then you're going to ask all the questions that way. Now, I will tell you that resiliency and resourcefulness can be difficult when you're working with somebody with a dual diagnosis. So my suggestions would be, again, paint a picture. Give them a scenario and see how they react or what their answer would be. So let's say that they ride the bus. You could say, okay, you missed the bus this morning. How does that affect your day? And that's going to tell you a little bit of resiliency. If they tell you that they dwell on it or they that ruin their entire day, their resiliency is pretty low at that point. They're not really able to pick themselves back up and keep going. And then same with resourcefulness. This kind of plays into the same scenario. If they don't pick themselves up, they haven't found a new way to do it or a new way to get there. And that kind of gives you an overview of what that would be. Okay, so now we're going to get into the domains. Before I get into the domains, I do want to point out that caregiver strengths and needs can be filled out. It does not always have to be filled out. When you're working with someone with a dual diagnosis, you may or may not have their family members or caregivers there. If they're there, they want to participate, you can fill it out. It's pretty simple and straightforward. If they're not there, it is not something that you have to figure out. It's not something you have to fill out when they're not there. That doesn't really make much sense. Okay, so the first domain, we're going to just be using this one as the example, crisis support, and we're going to go through the questions. I'm going to give you an overview of how I ask them, but before I even start asking questions when it comes to somebody with a dual diagnosis, there's a couple things I do before I even get to the domain part. First, I ask them how many hours they actually want when it comes to their hours and what they're expecting. And then I ask, why are we here? Why do you want peer support? What is important to you to work on? And I kind of get an overview of, do they know what we do? And so if they don't, I give them a little bit of an overview. Maybe they have a misconstrued view of what we do. Maybe they think that we're just transportation, and that's where I should be informing them of what we actually do. And then I go over what we're going to be doing that day. So clear expectations. We're going to be going over 6 areas that you can work on. However, in the dual diagnosis program, we try to stick to only 1 to 3 areas. And the reason that we do that is so that we can keep focused on what's really important. So when you're working with somebody with a dual diagnosis, they might say, I want to work on everything. And I'm going to tell them that's awesome. But let's do it in a way that makes sense. So let's talk about what's truly important to you. What are you really, really, really excited about working on? What do you think is extremely important to get done? And then we're going to add a couple extras on. And then I'm going to tell you we're going to make some stretch goals. So stretch goals are goals that we do after the main goals are done. So I think it's amazing that you want to do all this stuff, and I'm super excited for you. But we need to focus on what is really truly important and how do we get you to that point first, and then we can add on more goals as we go. It just shows that we are focusing in on what's really important, and we're keeping our peers focused in on what's really important. And you can have those conversations with them. Now, if you have a whole big spiel with them and they're like, no, I want to work on every single thing, I'm not going to say no. It is peer driven. So if they're like, no, I still want to work on all 6 domains, I still want to get all this stuff done, okay, I'm going to put it all in. But then I'm going to be having a conversation with that CPS afterwards to see how can we still keep that peer focused in order to achieve at least a goal or 2 in that 6 months, because it's going to be very bogged down, and that can be very overwhelming to a peer. So having that conversation with your CPS afterwards is really key. All right, so now we're going to get into the actual questions. And then I ask them, very simple questions, because I'm not going to be able to ask them, do you have psychosis? Most peers with a dual diagnosis are not going to know what psychosis means, or they're not going to understand what you're asking. So I will ask, have you ever had a time where you saw or heard something that wasn't there, or you thought something was going on and it actually wasn't? And then I'm going to ask a little bit more clarification if they say yes. Okay, tell me about that time. Tell me what was going on. Give me a little bit more information, because then I'm going to be able to put it as a 1, 2, or 3 if they answer yes to that question. And then I can, if it's a 2 or 3, add in that specific information in those boxes. And then I'm going to do the same for all of the rest of them. So instead of just saying depression, I'm going to say, have you been diagnosed with depression? If not, have you ever had a time where you felt you couldn't get up out of bed and you just were really, really upset, and it lasted for a very long period of time? So I'm asking them different ways to ask, do you have depression? And then I'm going to ask what it looks like if they do answer yes. Well, what does your depression look like? What does it look like now? What does it look like when you're not doing well? Because I kind of, again, want to paint that picture of what I am seeing and what that peer is experiencing. And then you're going to go through and you're going to keep asking. Now, I will tell you that with some of these, they are going to be answering yes, but you want to know more information. So if they answer yes to anger, everyone has anger. So I want to know, to what extent is that anger? Are you throwing things? Are you yelling? Is it uncontrollable? Does it get to a point where you just can't help it and you need to let it out? I want to know what it looks like. Then you're going to get down to this section where you're going to have some hard questions. And the first hard question you're going to get to is exploitation. So I will tell you that, knowing our stats, our population of dual diagnosis is extremely vulnerable. someone who has an intellectual disability is 85% of the time has been abused, 90% of the time has been sexually abused. So this question can be very difficult, and especially if they don't understand. So usually what I ask is, has there ever been a time that you felt like you were being taken advantage of or abused, or someone has taken your items, or things that you have bought? Have you ever been in an uncomfortable situation with a person? And then if they're willing, I want to know a little bit more if they want to give that information. And with this question, you want to know if it has happened in the last 30 days. Because if it has happened in the last 30 days, then I'm going to have additional questions. Is it still happening? Because then again, as a supervisor and working in peer support, I have a duty to then be a mandated reporter. And then that's going to be a whole nother question. That's going to be a whole nother conversation that we should be having. Most people that I have experienced doing an ANSA with have had exploitation in their lives, not in the past 30 days, so they usually end up being a 1. But that's really key for us to know in the future as well for CPSs and supervisors, because again, we don't want to re-traumatize someone, we don't want to re-victimize someone. So if they're willing to talk about it, that is absolutely fantastic. If they're not willing to talk about it, that's okay too. Everybody heals and deals with things on their own, and in their own time. The next one that's really difficult sometimes for intellectual disabilities and mental health is sexual aggression. Now, I never ask, do you have sexual aggression? First of all, people don't really understand that. So most of the time you're going to get the answer no. And that's not always the accurate picture that we're looking for. So I will ask something like, have you ever had a time that you got in trouble for maybe touching somebody when you shouldn't have, or not understanding boundaries when it comes to another individual, or contacting someone when you really shouldn't have been contacting them, or showing up at their work when you shouldn't have been there? Because that's going to give me a little bit of an overview of where they are in relationship and if they understand relationships. And then I can kind of get more then into the sexual part of things. Have you ever forced anyone to do things that they were not willing to do? Have you ever been forced to do things? That kind of stuff. Sexual aggression is a little bit tougher for dual diagnosis because we do have a gap in our education with how do we educate individuals with an intellectual disability or dual diagnosis sexuality and being safe. It's actually one of the things that I'm going to be working on coming up here shortly is sexuality and intellectual disabilities. Substance abuse and criminal behavior are pretty straightforward. Do you use or have you used drugs? Have you been in trouble with the law? And then I kind of want them to paint a picture again. I want to know some of the details so that I can then help them with, is it 1, 2, or 3? So next we're going to talk about SMART goals. So first it's going to ask you, will you be working on decreasing your identified areas in crisis support focus area? You're going to put yes or no. If you put no, you're going to have to put why. They do not want to work in that goal. If you say yes, which is what we're going to be picking, then you're going to keep scrolling down and you're going to pick a goal. So that 1A goal, you're going to pick one of those or more for that peer to work on. So you're going to pick the goal that the peer wants to work on, and in this example, they picked develop and implement strategy using early signs to prevent, cope with relapse, and avoid crisis. So you're going to pick that goal area, and then if they want any more, you're going to pick those goal areas, and then you're going to scroll down. So this is a section that you're going to be completing with what they are currently experiencing, what it looks like, maybe specific signs and symptoms of their own crisis experience. In our example, we were using anger, so maybe they can talk about throwing things at mom, yelling at mom, how often that's happening. And then you're going to put working on this goal is important or will improve my life because you're going to be putting from their perspective, why is this goal important? What do they want to work on? Why do they not want to yell at mom anymore? And then you're going to check the where you can work with the peer. So community, home, or phone, or all. And then you're going to fill out the measurable part. That's going to actually pre-populate. So your average ANSA crisis score is going to pre-populate to what the peer answered above and their score. And that's kind of for our own data collection, so you don't really have to worry about that section. The baselines. Now, when you're working with somebody with a dual diagnosis, they usually don't understand what you mean by baseline. So I can't just say, what do you think your current baseline is for support, needed for support? So usually what I ask is, okay, let's talk about anger and how much is mom helping you with that? And how much is it, hindering your life and stopping you from doing things? Because that's going to give me kind of more of a picture of, where they're at with support, how much support they need right now. And then I'm going to ask them, do you want mom to continue to help you? And what is that help going to look like? What do you want in the future? Do you want to have less anger outbursts and mom only be there as needed? Because that's going to, again, give them that picture without saying, what's your next baseline? They're not going to understand baseline. The other thing, too, is something to keep in mind. Not everybody is going to be independent. We're not always going to be able to put a 0 for the goal of baseline. They might tell you that they want to be a 0. Totally cool. Put it in. That's their goal. That is what we should be working towards. However, they're still saying, like, I'm still probably going to need a little bit of help or reminders or someone to be there. That's okay too. We want to meet them where they're at. So put that 1 in, put that 2 in. That's okay. The attainable part. Now, attainable and realistic. This is probably the hardest part working with someone that has a dual diagnosis. If you say to someone that has a dual diagnosis, I need you to come up with a goal and I need you to be attainable and realistic, they're not going to know really what you're talking about. And sometimes we even struggle with SMART goals. They can be really difficult. My suggestion is figure out what is the main goal. What do they want out of it? We already talked about maybe this person has anger issues. Okay, awesome. What we're going to be working on then is decreasing that anger. How do we do that? So then giving them options and giving them choices. How do you want to decrease your anger? Do you want to come up with some strategies, some coping skills, some other ways to get out that energy? Do you want to identify the triggers that you're experiencing? Where are they already at? Where do they want to be? And then we, as supervisors, can help them put that together. Okay, I'm hearing you. You say that you don't know why you get angry, and you say that you really want to not yell at mom anymore. So let's come up with some ways to do that. So first of all, we're going to have to figure out why you're doing it, right? So let's come up with 5 different ways of figuring out why you're angry, your triggers, and then let's start working on ways that you can get that anger out instead of yelling at mom. So we're going to come up with 2 different ways to get anger out before you yell at mom. And then we're going to keep trying this for how long? And then you ask them, how long do you want to keep trying that before you feel like you are confident that you can do it by yourself? And then you're going to put it into a SMART goal. I'm going to identify 5 of my triggers. Then I'm going to come up with 2 strategies to decrease my anger instead of yelling at my mother. Then I'm going to keep practicing these strategies for 2 months before I feel like I am independent. Boom, SMART goal. Time achieved by date, you're going to want to put 6 months or less. These need to be specific to what the peer thinks. So this is something that you ask them. How long do you think that's going to take you? We already know that the SMART goal you put in there says that you wanted 2 months of trying this exercise out. It might take you a few months to get those strategies. What do you think? and then go from there and try to help them build that time and achieve by date. And it should be specific to each goal as well. You shouldn't have the same achieve by date in each section. It should be different. Strengths for crisis, you're going to again be very personalized in this area. What have they already identified as strengths on the previous page, and where can we fit them into this goal? Does that make sense to them? And then ask them, what do you think you're going to be good at? And do you think there's going to be people helping you, or do you think you're going to already be working on it independently? So again, strengths, you want to be very personalized. This should be something that comes from them. If it is an other, you need to be writing in that box what they think for strengths. And this needs to be different from each different domain. So social networking and crisis support should not usually have the same strengths. They should be a little bit different because this is going to be different goal areas and different strengths that they're going to be using for each one. Now the ANSA score is going to be suggested at the top here. These are going to be a little bit different than you're used to. They might be a little higher in some areas, like crisis support, and they might be a little lower in certain areas, like maybe self-help and self-improvement. It depends on how they answer and what they're working on. The ANSA did change a little bit in the background for dual diagnosis, so you might see a little bit of change here. So then you're just going to be putting in how many hours they're requesting. Now I will tell you, when you're working with a dual diagnosis peer, their hours are usually actually lower, and it's because they're working on a lower amount of goals. So they're going to work on 1 to 3 goals. Their hours might be anywhere from 5 to 15 hours, but we usually see them around 5 to 10. That's the usual.